What's up, guys? Welcome to It's Just Irony, Dramatic Irony, and God's Justice in Daniel 6. This paper examines the transformational capacities and functions of characterization and irony in Daniel 6. It proposes a model in which Daniel and his opponents constitute caricaturized opposite poles of a spectrum. The narrative moves the reader, by means of the progress of the main character Darius, away from the faithless worldly perspective of Daniel's opponents on the one end of the spectrum, towards the faithful godly perspective represented by Daniel on the other end. Many of the ironies in Daniel 6 result from outcomes which upset the ordinary expectations of the, quote, worldly perspective. However, these same events lose their sense of irony as the reader increasingly adopts, in concert with Darius, the godly perspective which the character of Daniel personifies, that God's judgment is the reciprocation of good. The Hebrew name Daniel means God is my judge. Appropriately, the first 6 books of Daniel consist of royal court tales, which showcase the judgment of God. These court trials, so to speak, convey the verdict of God's judgment in terms of the outcomes of various characters' attitudes and behaviors. In general, God delivers and prospers characters whose actions God approves, while characters whose actions God does not approve largely destroy themselves. This process involves a palpable sense of dramatic irony, particularly in Daniel 6, raising the question, how does Daniel 6 make use of characterization and dramatic irony in its exposition of God's judgment? In that this question explores God's judgment, it constitutes a theological approach to the text. The question of what and how God approves is distinctly theological. This paper poses that question within the text and tradition critically narrow scope of the Leningrad Codex. Let me add a footnote here. The Leningrad Codex is the basis for contemporary editions of the Masoretic text. It preserves decent fidelity to the Hebrew Danielic tradition attested in 8 manuscripts discovered at Qumran. There are, however, 2 Greek versions of Daniel, the Old Greek and Theodotian traditions. Although this paper limits its scope, presentation, to the Masoretic text, future work could apply the methodology of the presentation to other Danielic textual traditions. So that's just something to think about. The primary concern of this presentation is, of course, you, the listener. The ultimate goal of this work is to facilitate a transformational reception of Daniel 6. The paper aims to involve the reader in the world of the text, in the sense which Sandra Schneiders describes as a, quote, mirror in which the reader is revealed to her or himself in the process of engaging the text. The reader's engagement with the text is fundamental to this presentation because it posits that a shift in the reader's perception of irony occurs in concert with a shift in his or her own orientation to the attitudes and behaviors of certain characters. This thesis is irreducibly complex and therefore warrants explicit presentation. In Daniel 6, irony provisionally manifests in order to guide the reader to the adoption of the text's theological view. Many of these apparent ironies subside as the reader increasingly adopts a view of God's justice as the reciprocation of good. An explanation of the structure through which this investigation approaches that thesis will be helpful. First, the presentation addresses its methods. It provides a brief overview of irony and the various meanings of irony in order to clarify what this investigation does not mean by that term. Next, it explains in detail the nature of dramatic irony, the type of irony which this investigation does explore in Daniel 6. Then the investigation moves on to analysis of characters and characterization, giving a brief overview of those literary methods before describing the results of their application in Daniel 6. Finally, this paper examines God's judgment as the reciprocation of good, or lack thereof, through the following topics: seeking and finding, power, life, and faith. It subdivides each topic according to the 3 substantial characters of Daniel 6, Daniel, Daniel's opponents, and Darius, while paying attention to the function of irony and what it reveals about the theological positions within the text. Irony is a notoriously ambiguous term. Its literary definitions validate that reputation. The Handbook of Biblical Criticism defines irony as, quote, the statement of one thing with the intention of suggesting something else. However, under this broad umbrella are several fairly distinct notions of irony, namely Socratic or behavioral irony, verbal irony, romantic irony, irony of the new criticism, existential or cosmic irony, and dramatic irony. This paper deals only with the latter type, dramatic irony. However, a brief explanation of the preceding terms will clarify more precisely what this investigation does not mean by irony. The term irony originally derives from a character trope in classical Greek literature. The character of the Iron, the self-deprecating Iron feigns fear or frustration while triumphing over his opponents, often utilizing a false retreat as a means of entrapment. The Dictionary of Concepts of Literary Criticism and Theory gives an example from Plato's Republic, in which Socrates feigns fear of his opponent's angry questioning. Quote, Thrasymachus, I said with a quiver, have mercy on us. Our error, if we were guilty of any error, was certainly unintentional, and therefore you, in your wisdom, should have pity on us. Socrates acts as the quintessential Iron in Plato's writing, hence the term Socratic or behavioral irony. Note that Socrates deprecates himself to the actual situation of his opponent. Thrasymachus is the one who has made an error. He uses that feint as a platform from which to model to Thrasymachus the behavior which Socrates does advocate. The self-deprecating, benevolent nature of Socratic irony constitutes its real genius. By medieval times, however, the term irony had expanded to a more general concept of stating the opposite of what one intends, sarcasm, or verbal irony. This concept of irony departs from the behavior of the Iron in that it is not necessarily self-deprecating. Rather than modeling the position which it prescribes, as Socratic irony does, sarcasm, or verbal irony, can instead model the position which it proscribes. If Socrates were to say, I'm sure you're correct, Thrasymachus, that I'm being an angry, arrogant jerk. Oh, that being an angry, arrogant jerk is really wise. That would be an example of verbal irony. The late 18th century saw the emergence of romantic irony, which muses on the self-awareness of finite existence in an infinite reality. Or similarly, the difference between art and life. I don't know why that picture is not showing up. It's that's a cat attacking a woman doing an upward-facing dog yoga pose. For example, Socrates might point out the romantic irony of the vast gulf between human aspirations of wisdom and the reality of human foolishness. In the 20th century, new critics found irony in the balanced tension between concepts and emotions within a single work, between the content and the response that it elicits, or in the relationship of parts of a text to its wider context within the whole. There are therefore various types of irony which fit the framework of the irony of the new criticism. To give just one example, if Socrates were to experience in his conversations about wisdom simultaneous joy and sadness, this would constitute the balanced tension with which the new critics identified irony. Finally, existential or cosmic irony consists of relishing life's absurdity or meaninglessness, or dark humor. As an example of existential irony, Socrates might ask Thrasymachus, "Isn't it delightful that the world is doomed to foolishness?" The sense of irony here refers to the enjoyment derived from those aspects of life which are least appreciable. While there are common threads of deception and paradox that run through each of these concepts of irony, each concept has its unique emphasis. Some interpreters have argued for the presence of some of these types of irony in Daniel 6. In his book Lions, Ovens, and Visions, David M. Valletta construes Daniel as a political satire laden with verbal irony or sarcasm. This interpretation regards Daniel as being at odds with colonial power, represented by Darius. In this case, Daniel's respectful words, such as, "May the king live forever," are nothing more than pure sarcasm directed at an oppressive imperial enemy. Likewise, Carolyn J. Sharp identifies in Daniel 6, quote, "a highly self-conscious textuality that ironizes notions of power." In this case, Darius's pitiful gullibility and his overestimation of himself are meant to lampoon political powers that were contemporary with the date of authorship. In both cases, Daniel 6 would constitute a satirical work of verbal irony. However, a close reading of the text problematizes the position that the author of Daniel 6 intended to engage in a struggle for worldly power through satire. The fact that Darius, as this paper will argue, is the main character of the text makes it unlikely that he is one of its villains. Moreover, a later discussion of the approach of power dynamics, which Daniel 6 advocates, through the character of Daniel, is at odds with the satirical reading of Daniel 6. If the interpretations of this paper are legitimate, then a satirical reading of Daniel 6 misses its point entirely. Thus, based on the roles of characters in this chapter and on the text's positions about God's reciprocation of power, it does not appear that Daniel 6 intentionally manifests any of the aforementioned types of irony. Only dramatic irony is undeniably extant in Daniel 6. Even so, much of what appears to be ironic loses its sense of dramatic irony when regarded from a theological perspective which the text commends. The Dictionary of Concepts in Literary Criticism and Theory defines dramatic irony as a clash between intention and result, anticipation and fulfillment, expectation and event. An example from Daniel 6 will help us to illustrate dramatic irony. At the outset of his commentary, Dale Ralph Davis quips, Daniel 6 begins with a miracle, a squeaky clean politician. Davis refers to Daniel as a politician on account of Daniel's political appointment as a satrap, and subsequently as the overseer of the satraps. He describes Daniel as, quote, squeaky clean because Daniel's opponents are not able to find any fault in him, in verse 4. A politician is someone who is held in high enough esteem to acquire or maintain power, despite the ironic fact that this process often showcases the least admirable aspects of our nature. In keeping with our definition of dramatic irony, then, the drastic contradiction between the proposition of a squeaky clean politician and the regularly observable pattern of our political reality present a situation of dramatic irony and justifies Davis's humorous incredulity. Davis describes the possibility of a squeaky clean politician as a, quote, miracle because it would constitute an extreme or even opposite departure from expectation. A holy man in a notoriously sinful social position would be unbelievable or miraculous. It seems like an oxymoron, an excellent example of irony. While dramatic irony therefore constitutes a departure from expectation, it often exhibits multiple layers, a fact which, if left unrecognized, complicates the identification of irony. The, quote, squeaky clean politician example perfectly models this potential confusion. If Daniel is a squeaky clean politician, then is he not merely what a politician is supposed to be? But if Daniel merely meets expectations, then why does the concept of a, quote, squeaky clean politician carry a sense of irony? Does irony defy expectation or not? The answer is that it does. The confusion arises from the multiple layers of irony. First of all, politicians are supposed to be exemplary, and yet, ironically, they are not. That is the first layer of dramatic irony. Then, given that politicians are not what they are supposed to be, it is ironic when politicians are what they are supposed to be. That is the second layer of irony. Thus, even when dramatic irony appears to meet expectations, the irony derives from the fact that what should be expected is no longer expected. This kind of dramatic irony, this kind of layered dramatic irony, is abundant in Daniel 6, on account of the discrepancy between what the text presents as flawed and ideal expectations, which this paper describes as, quote, worldly and, quote, godly expectations, respectively. Because dramatic irony hinges on expectation, the reader's impression of dramatic irony in Daniel 6 depends upon the reader's own affinity for what the text will set up as either, quote, worldly or, quote, godly expectations. Thus, if the text subsequently succeeds in transposing the reader's expectations towards godly expectations, then the reader's sense of dramatic irony in the text will shift as a result of the reading. The study examines two different aspects of literary characters: character type and characterization. In his book, Old Testament Narrative, Jerome T. Walsh distinguishes these two terms, explaining that character type refers to the, quote, relative importance and comparative complexity of characters, while characterization refers to, quote, the process by which the narrator endows those characters with importance and complexity. Walsh makes use of E.M. Forster's distinction between flat and round characters. Flat characters are, in Forster's words, constructed around a single idea or quality. Round characters, on the other hand, are complex and multifaceted, possessing many traits which might even be in tension with one another. The concept of flat and round characters constitute two hypothetical poles of character type. Actual character types generally fall somewhere on the continuum between these two poles, tending either more towards flat or more towards round. In general, the main characters of stories are round characters, while supporting characters are more flat. These distinctions are essential to the study of characters in Daniel 6. Walsh draws one other relevant distinction about character types: group characters. Group characters consist of a group of individuals, often unnamed, who are referred to as a single entity, often with the pronoun they. The lack of group characters' individual identity often reflects those characters' relative unimportance in the narrative. Narratives establish these character types through characterization. Walsh distinguishes three modes of characterization: telling, direct showing, and indirect showing. Telling consists of a narrator's direct description of a character. Although this mode of characterization is the simplest and perhaps crudest, in most cases it is also the most authoritative and trustworthy mode of characterization, depending on the trustworthiness of the narrator. Next, direct showing consists of what a character's own words or actions reveal about them. Internal monologue or prayer, for example, are largely free from pretense and are therefore highly disclosive instances of direct showing. On the other hand, there are many cases in which characters' words or actions have ambiguous implications, sometimes revealing hardly anything about the characters themselves. Thus, direct characterization can take many forms and can vary widely in terms of transparency. Finally, indirect showing refers to what is revealed about one character through the words and actions of other characters. For example, if the way in which other characters address a certain character were to reveal something about that character, that would be an instance of indirect showing. In summary, narratives portray characters as either more round or more flat by means of three modes of characterization: telling, direct showing, and indirect showing. In Daniel 6, the round character Darius serves as the reader's point of identification on a continuum which spans between two opposite poles. At either extreme are two distinct perspectives. They are personified and distilled into the flat character of Daniel at the one end, and the flat character group of Daniel's opponents at the other end. The action of the world of the text intends to shift the reader away from the perspective of Daniel's opponents and towards the perspective which Daniel represents by transporting Darius, the reader's point of identification, in that direction over the course of the narrative. Daniel's opponents represent what could be called a, quote, worldly perspective, and that the narrative paints them as primarily concerned with political or worldly things. Their plan to prohibit the worship of all gods except for the king, who they manipulate, demonstrates that they are unconcerned not only with Daniel's Yahweh, but evidently with any serious notion of divinity. Daniel 6 portrays this flat character group in a distinctly villainous light through direct and indirect characterization, which we'll explore further later on. Meanwhile, because Daniel is, by contrast, almost solely concerned with God, he typifies what might be called a, quote, godly perspective. Early on, the reliable third-person narrator portrays Daniel's ideal heroism through the characterization mode of telling. Quote, there was an excellent spirit within him, in verse 3. Surprisingly, however, Daniel's character type is even more flat, and his role is even more limited than that of his opponents. While Daniel's opponents indirectly characterize him on occasion by means of their accusations, Daniel himself acts only once in verse 10 and speaks only once in verse 21. The thoughts, feelings, and even actions of Daniel and his opponents are often conspicuous gaps in the narrative. Thus, contrary to what one might expect about the narrative, the narrative's heroic figure, Daniel is not the main character of Daniel 6. The role of main character belongs to Darius. While Daniel and his opponents constitute flat, perhaps unrealistic caricatures of their worldly and godly orientations, Darius is complex or round. The narrative takes place from an external point of view, mostly from an angle that is oriented with Darius. The chapter conveys those actions of Daniel and his opponents which occur away from Darius with a basic level of detail that is commensurate with what Darius might have heard through, for example, a cursory second-hand report. However, when Daniel and his opponents are in Darius's presence, the text more fully discloses their words and actions. Meanwhile, the narrative details Darius's variously ill-advised, frenetic, or commendable actions. In that the level of detail in Daniel 6 scales in proportion with Darius's presence, it follows that the chapter's point of view reflects a Darius-oriented angle. This higher level of detail and the dynamism of Darius's words and actions indicate that Darius is the main character. While what little is known of Daniel and his opponents remains largely static, Darius himself swings wildly from emotions of anxiety to jubilation, and from actions which the narrative presents as foolish to actions which seem ultimately wise. Darius's initial decisions reflect a position that has some things in common with the positions of Daniel's opponents, while his final words and actions reveal that Darius has been favorably transformed towards Daniel's orientation. Thus, Darius is by far the most relatable character for imperfect and dynamic human readers. The narrative immerses the reader in Darius's angle so that the reader shares in the transformative experience which Darius undergoes. In concert with Darius, the reader moves towards Daniel's ideal position. The reader's movement with Darius directly affects the sense of irony in the work. As the reader moves with Darius away from the perspective of Daniel's opponents and towards Daniel's perspective, the events of the story decreasingly perplex expectation, thus losing their sense of irony. Characters which the text approves benefit from God's reciprocation of goodness, while characters which the text does not approve are destroyed as a consequence of their own bad actions. As briefly mentioned, the first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel consist of court tales, which take the form of trials. God's response to certain behaviors and attitudes renders the verdict of these, quote, court trials, so to speak. In general, God's response takes the form of a reward or some demonstration of favor. Accordingly, these chapters of Daniel rarely attribute to God events which negatively affect a character. Only the overthrow of Belshazzar and Nebuchadnezzar's loss of sanity may be construed as such, and even so, those cases are not clear. Although Belshazzar is weighed and found lacking, in 527, he is killed by the Medo-Persian conquest of Babylon, the actions of men, and not necessarily God. It is only clear that God does not rescue Belshazzar. Moreover, insanity has a positive outcome for Nebuchadnezzar, who subsequently recounts the event with praises to God in Daniel 4. The rest of the actions associated with God in the Danielic court tales consist of support or deliverance. Thus, the Danielic court tales clearly emphasize reward above punishment as God's modus operandi. Daniel 6 itself does not explicitly attribute any punishment to God whatsoever, but illustrates God's judgment in terms of reward. By placing Darius's second decree in a triumphal context, the narrative validates his description of God as one who punishes, not as one who punishes, but as, quote, a deliverer and rescuer and doer of signs and wonders, in verse 27. Meanwhile, those who are not rewarded with deliverance and rescue largely destroy themselves. Thus, God's judgment in Daniel 6 reciprocates, perhaps disproportionately, a measure of whatever good it finds, while it does not reward those who are, quote, found lacking. The following sections discuss various examples of this dynamic in Daniel 6. Seeking and finding is perhaps the most salient theme of Daniel 6. Those two terms derive from the Aramaic roots ba'ah and shakach, respectively. Variations of ba'ah occur 7 times, while forms of shakach occur 8 times, for a remarkable total of 15 times in this short chapter. The harping on this theme in Daniel 6 constitutes an example of the literary concept of Leitwortstil, the repetition of particular words in order to draw attention to what they reveal about the wider significance of the text. The nearly incessant repetition of, quote, seeking and, quote, finding in Daniel draw attention to these terms and point to the chapter's implicit theology of reciprocation. What one seeks is reciprocated in the form of what one finds. The narrative illustrates this dynamic in the stark contrast between the seeking and finding that Daniel does versus the seeking and finding of his opponents. Daniel's opponents seek to find fault, and, albeit in an ironic way, fault is what they find. The root ba'ah, seek, appears in various pa'el forms. In verse 8, Daniel's opponents petition the king to forbid petition from any god other than himself. A conventional English translation would likely differentiate the verb and noun, opting for something like seeking petition. However, such anglicization has the adverse consequence of obfuscating the blatant Leitwortstil in the repetition of ba'ah, thereby diminishing the intentional salience of that term. Meanwhile, the fact that Daniel's opponents petition from the king reflects their sense of where the means to obtain what they seek resides, the human power structures to which they belong, and which supposedly culminates in Darius. In this sense, then, where Daniel's opponents direct their petition reflects the worldly perspective which they represent. Meanwhile, shakach, or find, appears in the Hafel and Hithpael. In verse 6, Daniel's opponents recognize that they will only, quote, find fault in Daniel if they find it in the laws of his God. Find it concerning the law of his God. Ironically, in seeking to find fault, Daniel's opponents expose their own fault. The text explains that they are appointed to their positions so that the king will not have damage, verse 3, presumably to prevent corruption among the satraps. Presciently, Darius appoints Daniel to oversee them because of Daniel's excellent spirit, verse 4. The motivation behind their subsequent opposition to Daniel constitutes a major gap in the text. There are 2 possibilities, both of which are ironic in different ways. The first possibility entails corruption. Daniel's opponents, assigned to root out corruption, are, ironically, guilty of corruption at Darius's expense, or they wish to engage in corruption in the future. In this case, it is also ironic that corrupt officials seek to find corruption in Daniel. It is even more ironic that seeking to charge Daniel with corruption ultimately reveals their own corruption. W. Sibley Towner suggests an alternative political explanation. Quote, with the triumvirate of presidents and many satraps, a kind of decentralized system is in operation. Therefore, the possibility that Daniel might be made number 1 behind the king would also undermine the local prerogatives and rights of the officers within the realm. This might be especially threatening when the man of distinction is a foreigner and a Jew. Towner suggests that Daniel's opponents could be acting to preserve local autonomy. In this scenario, conceptions of their motives could range from anti-monarchical or anti-colonial to patriotic or even xenophobic. In this case, it would still be ironic that officials appointed to oversee the prosperity of government affairs attempt to remove from his post a man who is appointed on account of his, quote, excellent spirit. Thus, even if the officials are not initially corrupt and their motivations are potentially reasonable from a worldly point of view, ironically, they nonetheless become corrupt by seeking to find accusations against the innocent Daniel. Importantly, this case demonstrates that what may seem justifiable or even noble from a worldly perspective, so-called necessary evils, nonetheless constitute corruption. In all of these cases, the irony largely derives from the difference between the expectations of Daniel's opponents' worldly mindset, which determines what they seek, and what they actually find. However, the apparently ironic contrast between what is sought and what is found turns out, also ironically, to be perfect congruence. The officials seek, quote, fault, and they find fault. The very act of seeking to find fault constitutes the fault for which they are eventually condemned and fed to the lions. Thus, what appears to be an ironic twist as a departure from expectation is actually not ironic in the sense that it is perfectly just. Daniel's opponents, in a sense, find what they seek. Daniel also finds what he seeks in a certain sense. The fact that Daniel, a captive, is exalted to such a high position of authority seems ironic from a, quote, worldly perspective. However, if one supposes that God has influence over Daniel's life, the successful blameless man who seeks God is hardly surprising. Verse 5 pairs Ba'ah and Shakach in a single verse. Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, but they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. ESV verse 5. The blatant use of leitwort still draws the reader's attention to the activities of seeking and finding. The satraps are seeking to find fault in Daniel, as discussed. The quality of Daniel's seeking condemns them by contrast. Daniel's opponents found Daniel making petition and plea before his God, in verse 11. They repeat this phrase in their report to Darius in verse 14. Again, English translations may obfuscate the leitwort still here. The ESV's phrase, making petition, is a rendition of Ba'ah, which this investigation has also been translating as seeking. Thus, while it is ironic that the presidents seek to find fault in Daniel but find him blameless, it is even more ironic that they subsequently seek to find fault in connection with Daniel's commendable spirituality, and indeed find him seeking God. Again, the fact that Daniel's opponents seek to find fault in his goodness constitutes their own fault. Meanwhile, Daniel, who seeks God, is found blameless. In verse 23, unharmed in the midst of the lion's den, Daniel declares that he was, quote, found innocent by God. And in verse 24, the narrator confirms that no injury was, quote, found on him. Injury representing fault in this trial by ordeal. Daniel seeks to find God, and Daniel, quote, is found innocent by God. The wordplay is not a coincidence. The parallel verbs reflect the reciprocal action which God takes up on Daniel's behalf. Note that Daniel's opponents actively find, while Daniel is passively found. Daniel's opponents seek fault and destruction, and they do find that. Daniel seeks to find God, and God reciprocates so that Daniel is found. Daniel's opponents attempt to undermine and acquire power in the cause of conflict Daniel's opponent's attempt to undermine and acquire power is the cause of conflict in Daniel 6. Ironically, Daniel's opponent's plan for self-advancement ultimately leads to their destruction. Regardless of their motive, the power which they have as overseers of the satraps is not enough for them, and thus they rebel against not only Daniel but against King Darius, and even against any notion of God, Yahwistic or otherwise. Their rebellion against their overseer, Daniel, is made obvious. They accuse Daniel because they wish to overthrow him. However, the narrative's explanation of the ironic outcome is somewhat subtle, idiomatically describing their accusations as ahal, literally eat. A wooden translation of verse 24 reads, "And he spoke, the king, and they brought, the mighty men, those who had eaten pieces of Daniel, and into the den of lions they cast them." While their fate seems ironic, the thread of meaning that is subtly conveyed through the idiomatic use of the verb ahal is also highly appropriate. Let's try that again. While their fate seems ironic, the thread of meaning that is subtly conveyed through the idiomatic use of the verb ahal is also highly appropriate. Those who figuratively eat Daniel are literally eaten themselves. The rebellion of Daniel's opponents against the king is also subtle. They appear extremely deferential to Darius at the outset. Ironically, their guise of reverence is actually a means of manipulating and gaining power over the king. The officials seem to deceive the king when they tell him that, quote, all the presidents have, quote, consulted together and agreed upon the decree. At the very least, it is clear that Daniel was not consulted. Moreover, ironically, Daniel's opponents overpowered Darius by exploiting the power of Darius's own government, tricking him into a position that he cannot escape from. They remind Darius twice, and Darius himself affirms at once, that he is powerless to change his laws once they are written, in verses 8, 12, and 15. Ironically, and yet fittingly, Darius subsequently places them in a place from which they cannot escape, where the lions overpower, quote, overpower, and even, quote, rule over them. Finally, Daniel's opponents blatantly disregard the power of God. They not only accuse Daniel, who is a godly man, but they do so by having the worship of God prescribed. There is no sense that they fear reprisal from any god for their unjust actions. Ironically, because they do not acknowledge a need for God, their destruction at the paws of the same lions from which Daniel was saved proves that they were wrong. Only God could have saved them from the situation they got themselves into. However, because they sought Daniel's condemnation, there is nothing for God to reciprocate in order to come to their acquittal. The presidents do not give themselves over to God's power, and Yahweh does not exercise his power of deliverance for them. As the foil for his opponents, Daniel submits to the power of God and to Darius's power, inasmuch as Darius's power does not conflict with God's power. His submission to God is quite overt. While Daniel's opponents were busy vying for power, Daniel kneeled on his knees and prayed and gave thanks before his God, in verse 10. It is hard to imagine a more submissive position or a more overt acknowledgement of power than kneeling before someone in thanksgiving. From the opponent's perspective, it might seem ironic that Daniel gives thanks to God after learning of his entrapment, but from Daniel's perspective of faith in God's deliverance, the thanksgiving is perfectly warranted. Likewise, Daniel is faithful to King Darius. Although this conclusion is less obvious, the accusation which Daniel's opponents bring against him is that he does not regard the king or the decree which the king has signed, in verse 13. Thus, it seems ironic that Daniel later interprets this deliverance to mean that he has not wronged the king. Quote, they have not harmed me because I was found blameless before him, God, and also before you, O king, I have done no harm. Verse 22. The decree which Daniel does disregard, he does disregard a decree, but it does not actually represent Darius's will. It is an invention of Darius and Daniel's rebellious underlings. Resisting the decree is not only an act of submission to God, but is also an exercise of Daniel's rightful authority over the satraps, an act which subsequently empowers Darius, which I'll discuss later. Thus, while Daniel's resistance to the decree has the appearance of rebellion, it is actually an act of faithfulness to God and to the king. Thus, the character Daniel's proper treatment of power initiates power's proper treatment of him. Although the king's power fails Daniel, the king favors Daniel because of his faithful submission to his power. More importantly, because Daniel gives himself over to God's power, God reciprocates by exercising his power for Daniel in his time of need. While the dynamic of surrendering power in order to gain it might seem ironic, it is perfectly sensible from the perspective that God reciprocates good. Thus, once again, the irony is contingent on an orientation towards the, quote, worldly perspective. The same outcome is not ironic from the theological perspective, which the narrative commends through its personification, the flat, ideal Daniel. As the reader's point of identification, Darius learns the most about power dynamics. Darius's revelation entails disillusionment about his own power and a realization of the extent of God's power, Daniel's God. Apparently, Darius is initially so confident of his own power that he is willing to go along with a decree which exclusively honors his own divinity. Quote, whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions, in verse 7. By signing a decree that bans the worship of God, Darius initially exhibits alienation from the godly perspective of Daniel. Moreover, the decree which Darius makes with implicit reference to his own power ironically constitutes a manifestation and demonstration of Darius's impotence. Daniel's opponents easily dupe the king with flattery and false reverence, manipulating him into a decree which runs contrary to his own interests. Ironically, these are the overseers of the satraps to whom Darius, and his godlike judge of character, to phrase it with verbal irony, saw fit to entrust his kingdom. Not only is Darius easily fooled, but as a result he is trapped by the alleged immutable power of his own decree. The futility of Darius's effort to free himself and Daniel from this trap reveal the actually not so vast extent of the would-be God King's power. Many commentators point to Darius's initial folly as the mark of political satire and resistance literature. In this view, Darius represents imperial power, the incompetence of which is meant to encourage political resistance. This kind of lampooning, the argument goes, might have been welcomed, for instance, by second-century Jewish readers struggling to regain political power from such foreign tyrannical overlords as Antiochus IV. However, Carolyn Sharp's anti-political reading seems more in keeping with Danielic literature. She situates Daniel 6 in a constellation of ironies, constellation of ironies that use the cultural act of writing to problematize the ephemeral nature of political rule, and to inscribe the lasting power of God's rule. In the wider scope of Danielic literature, Darius is one of many kings and kingdoms who come and go with relative brevity, while the sovereignty of God persists. Rather than encouraging the political aspirations of the oppressed, the ephemeral nature of political rule, as Carolyn Sharp puts it, in Daniel, redirects the reader from positions of worldly esteem, which are shown to have little value, to the invaluable position of favor with God. Darius's positive qualities, despite his major shortcomings and also his redemption, problematize an interpretation of Darius as a spurned caricature of imperial power. Let me say that again. Darius's positive qualities, despite his major shortcomings, and also his redemption, problematize an interpretation of Darius as a spurned caricature of imperial power. Rather, readers must grapple with the possibility of identifying with Darius as the main character. That his ill-advised stab at divinization, as Towner puts it, and his foolhardy illusions of power are not the unique pitfalls of monarchs, but are common conditions of human life. Then Darius's mistake cannot be scoffed at as other on account of his foreignness or his position of power, allowing the text to function as a mirror through which the reader can share in Darius's growth. Through his humiliation and subsequent submission to God, Darius, the former God King, paves a way out for the would-be God reader. Having witnessed the authority of God over the allegedly immutable laws of the Medes and Persians, Darius, quote, writes again, Carolyn Sharp explains, placing the force of and unchangeability of his own earlier written words under erasure. There is irony in the fact that Darius receives the power to change his own laws only through first being trapped by them. God's ability to deliver Daniel from Darius's law demonstrates the higher authority of God. Darius subsequently submits to God by overturning his own decree as an act of submission. It is an acknowledgement that the power of his own law is not immutable, but is rather subject to God's will. Yahweh has proven his sovereignty at the lion's den. Thus, liberated from subjugation to the immutability of his own flawed law, Darius actually gains power by overturning his declaration of divinity and submitting to God. In this way, God reciprocates Darius's act of releasing power. By no stretch of the imagination do Daniel's opponents give their lives to God. It is important to note that Daniel's opponents are destined to fail because they serve the literary purpose of personifying the absolute wrong perspective. They are flat, simple caricatures rather than realistic Babylonian or Persian citizens. As such, their sole interest is the consolidation of their worldly power. The narrative makes no mention of any actions, words, or thoughts related to God, except for their plot to have Darius declare his exclusive worship. Because the plot manipulates Darius, it is clear that Daniel's opponents do not actually respect Darius as a deity. Thus, a significant part of what Daniel's opponents represent is absolute godlessness. Accordingly, when their pursuit of power finally jeopardizes their own lives, because Daniel's opponents have not given their lives to God, God cannot reciprocate anything in order to give them life, which would spare them from the ordeal at the lion's den. Not only do Daniel's opponents keep their lives for themselves rather than giving them to God, but they also seek to take the life of another. The presidents are willing to kill Daniel, who is authoritatively characterized as an innocent man, in their quest for power. Ironically, this plot will result in their total loss of power and their deaths. The wisdom of Solomon nicely captures this principle. Wherewithal a man sinneth, by the same also shall he be punished. Chapter 11, verse 6. It is their sins themselves which punish the presidents, and not necessarily God. However, because the presidents do not give but rather take life, there is nothing for God to reciprocate in the midst of the deaths which result from their sin. Because Daniel and his opponents are foils for each other, as expected, Daniel's actions and their outcomes are opposite from those of his opponents. He completely gives his life to God, and God reciprocates by giving life to him. Daniel seems Daniel seems totally reliant on his God, as is evinced by the fact that Daniel continues to pray to God after the decree instead of taking matters into his own hands with a simple solution of compromise. Ironically, Daniel's opponents identify his dedication to God as his weakness, when it is actually his strength. As Towner puts it, it is his sharp profile as an observant Jew that is both his downfall and his salvation. Through his own power, Daniel could easily resolve the situation for both himself and his friendly ally Darius, by making a small, temporary compromise of his reliance on God and ceasing to pray for 30 days. In contrast to the explicit and obvious idol of Daniel 3, the idol which is rejected in Daniel 6 is far more stealthy and insidious, one's own power. Daniel rejects this idol because he has given his life to God and no one else. Thus, God reciprocates Daniel's giving of life by giving Daniel life in his time of need, shutting the mouths of the lions. Daniel has not only dedicated his life to reliance on God, but he is also willing to lose it for God's sake. In order to rely on God, Daniel knowingly jeopardizes his own life. It may seem ironic from the worldly perspective of Daniel's opponents that Daniel saves his life through his willingness to lose it. However, from Daniel's perspective of God's reciprocation of good, it is completely logical. Daniel gives his life for God, and so God gives life to Daniel. Thus, as the reader increasingly adopts this perspective, the sense of irony about losing one's life in order to gain it gives way to a sense that this dynamic is logically sequential and thus not ironic. Daniel's opponents are not faithful to God in any way. In the absence of relationship, there is nothing for God to respond to in faithfulness. The fact that Daniel's opponents attempt to have Daniel condemned demonstrates their lack of faith. The presidents have no reverence for Daniel's devotion to God. Moreover, the ironic fact that they falsely condemn a man whose name means God is my judge reveals the extent of their unbelief. They are bold enough to accuse Daniel because, in their view, God will not intervene in Daniel's trial. Accordingly, God does not intervene in their trial. It may seem ironic that Daniel's faithless opponents are destroyed by a trial from which only God could have rescued them, as he rescues Daniel. However, from the perspective of God's reciprocity, it makes perfect sense. Because they have no faith in God, there is no faith for God to reciprocate. By contrast, Yahweh responds to Daniel's faith and faithful actions with a demonstration of his own faithfulness. Excuse me. While the trial by lions reveals the dishonor of the faithless presidents, the trial serves to glorify the faithfulness of Daniel and his God. There is irony in the fact that the attempts to undermine Daniel only exalt him to greater honor. It also appears ironic that the threat of death, ostensibly an obstacle to Daniel's faith relationship, becomes a demonstration of that faith instead. However, the irony is diminished from Daniel's godly perspective, which the text commends to the reader. These outcomes are hardly surprising from the perspective of God's reciprocation of good. The narrator explicitly states that Daniel is unharmed because he believed in his God in verse 23. The reliable voice of the narrator attributes this miraculous outcome to Daniel's faith. It seems ironic that choosing his faith over his own security is what establishes Daniel's security, or that Daniel's best defense is not to defend himself. This point also problematizes reading Daniel as a text of political resistance. Daniel does not resist with a focus on the decree. He does not voice any opposition to the decree, nor does he even make any self-defense after his opponents level their accusations against him. He merely continues to engage in his faith as he has always done. To stoop to political resistance in his own power would actually be a departure from that faith. Daniel deftly dodges this deadly dart, and his faithfulness is explicitly reciprocated. Daniel attributes his salvation to God. Quote, "My God sent his angel and shut the mouths of the lions," in verse 21. Thus, the apparent ironies of establishing security and defense by means of eschewing them, both in favor of faith, are actually the natural outcomes according to the theological position that God reciprocates any good which is shown to him. While this outcome appears ironic to the reader from the worldly perspective represented by Daniel's opponents, it makes perfect sense from the godly perspective personified by Daniel. As the point of identification for the reader, Darius transitions from a perspective of little faith to one of earnestly professed belief. Darius's nascent belief is rewarded with a show of God's reciprocation of faithfulness. At first, Darius's faith is basically at the same end of the spectrum as Daniel's opponents. If Darius perceives any problem with banning the worship of anyone but himself for 30 days, the text makes no mention of it. Rather, Darius approves this decree in verse 9. When Darius does come to regret this decision, the cause for his regret is still worldly. When Darius hears about Daniel, he, quote, "was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel." There is no sense that Darius regrets his affront to God, only that he has jeopardized the life of his faithful administrator. Nonetheless, like Daniel, Darius is imperiled, in a sense. He has some skin in the game, so to speak, albeit Daniel's skin. Thus, Darius faces an appropriately lesser trial than does Daniel, but it is a trial nonetheless. Initially, Darius miserably fails. Like the presidents, the king sets about in a whirlwind of action, trying to rescue Daniel through his own power. Quote, "He labored till the sun went down to rescue him," verse 14, but to no avail. Eventually, Darius's sense of defeat becomes palpable. Daniel's opponents visit Darius with another reminder that they have trapped him, repeating for the third time, "Know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed." Verse 15. In resignation, Darius gives the word to have Daniel thrown to the lions in verses 16 and 17. All of Darius's self-reliant actions culminate in a miserable failure. Ironically, as a direct result of Darius's own decree of faith in himself as a god king, Darius comes face to face with his own inability. We're just going to chat that whole sentence again. Ironically, as a direct result of Darius's own decree of faith in himself as a god king, Darius comes face to face with his own inability to be faithful to either his friends or even his own wishes. Utterly humbled and out of options, Darius makes a statement of faith in Daniel's God. "Your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you," in verse 16. Annoyingly, the Aramaic does not specify whether Darius's words constitute a positive conclusion of faith or merely desperate hope. The phrase Yishe, I probably should have figured this out beforehand. The phrase Yeshez benach, Yeshez binach. Sorry about that. Yeshez binach. The phrase Yeshez binach, which I have translated as "he will deliver you," is quite ambiguous. It is the third masculine singular form of the verb shazav in the uncommon Aramaic shafel stem. Because the stem is common in Akkadian, as Brown Driver Briggs points out, this form is probably a loan word. While the exact extensive or causative influence of the stem is difficult to determine, the primary point of ambiguity springs from the verb's imperfect tense. In Semitic languages, the imperfect may indicate ongoing action, future action, or modal action. Because the Shafel stem is sparsely attested, it is difficult to determine whether or not the verb has a distinct jussive form. That's like a modal subjunctive sense. Thus, Yishez binach may be rendered as either he will deliver you or may he deliver you, or let him deliver you, something like that. The second is the modal sense. The ambiguity is perhaps appropriate, however. While the statement indicates at least some level of faith, Darius is clearly distressed. In verse 18, he solemnly fasts the night away before rushing to the lion's den in the morning and calling out with a grieved voice to inquire whether or not his prior faith had been justified. In verse 20. Thus, if Darius had meant to declare that God would deliver Daniel in a certain future sense, the phrase was undeniably modal and uncertain within his heart. This corresponds to the reader's effort to believe and to move away from the incredulity of Daniel's opponent's worldly perspective towards the godly perspective of Daniel. It is ironic that Darius fasts after giving Daniel over to the hungry lions. However, God reciprocates this act of faithfulness, sending an angel to shut the mouths of the lions, causing them to abstain from Daniel in verse 22. Darius's initial nascent statement of faith is also reciprocated. God does, in fact, deliver Daniel. Thus, having observed that God reciprocates faithfulness, Darius makes his own confession, overturning his previous decree. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall have no end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions, in verse 26 and 27. The reversal of his prior decree in this confession reflects Darius's transition away from the worldly perspective personified by Daniel's now dead opponents to the godly perspective embodied in Daniel, who is still alive. The faithless worldly perspective has passed away, and the only complex character with which the reader can identify has adopted the perspective of Daniel. Through this dynamic, the text aims to move the reader towards the theological position reflected in Daniel's faithful actions and their outcomes, that God reciprocates faith and the actions of faith. Thus, the apparent ironies of Daniel 6 spring from the contradictions between the perspectives which the text addresses. Through Darius's point of view, the passage is designed to navigate the reader from the worldly, faithless perspective represented by the flat group character of Daniel's opponents to the godly perspective personified in the one-dimensional character of Daniel. While the circumstances and the events of the story defy ordinary expectation, represented by Daniel's opponents, thereby taking on the appearance of irony, they are actually perfectly logical and not ironic from the godly perspective of Daniel, that the judgment of God is the reciprocation of good. This paper examined 4 points of this principle. God finds those who seek him. God's power acts on behalf of those who act on behalf of God through their submission. God gives life to those who are willing to give their lives to him. And finally, God is faithful to those who reach out in faith to him, even to the most nascent of faiths like that of Darius. By presenting Darius as the point of identification for the reader, the ironic outcomes of Daniel 6 serve to move the reader in concert with Darius away from the worldly expectations and towards a godly perspective. This perspective reveals many of the apparently ironic events of Daniel 6 actually to be perfectly just outcomes of God's judgment as the reciprocation of good. The end. I would like this to work.